The blue lights come out of nowhere. You're just driving, maybe thinking about getting home, maybe halfway through a song, when suddenly your rear-view mirror flashes red and blue. Your stomach drops. You check your speed, your mirrors, your lane position. Too late. The signal's already there. Pull over. Your hands tighten on the wheel as you drift to the shoulder. The car behind you slows. The engine idles louder than usual, or maybe it just feels that way. You glance in the mirror again. The officer steps out. Slow, calm, watching everything. And then that thought hits you. What did I do wrong? Let me ask you something before we go any further. What actually goes through your mind the moment a police officer walks up to your window during a traffic stop? I want you to really think about that and drop your answer in the comments, because what most people believe in that moment is often exactly what gets them into trouble. And later on, I'm going to show you something that surprises a lot of drivers, especially the ones who think they're doing everything right. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost unbelievable at first. Someone calls the police expecting protection, expecting validation, expecting to be treated like the victim, and ends up in handcuffs instead. That's not just a viral headline, it happens more often than people think. The scenario usually starts with confidence, sometimes entitlement, sometimes fear mixed with anger. A driver believes they've been wronged, cut off, followed too closely, maybe involved in a parking lot dispute or a roadside argument. Emotions escalate, voices raise. Someone reaches for their phone and calls the police. "I want an officer here right now." That's the moment everything changes, whether they realize it or not. Because once law enforcement arrives, the situation is no longer about who called. It's about what actually happened, and more importantly, what the officer can prove, observe, and justify. And that's where people lose control of the situation without even noticing it. Let's walk through a realistic version of this. A woman, let's call her Karen because you've heard the stereotype, calls 911. She's frustrated. She tells dispatch another driver is being aggressive, maybe claims she felt threatened. Her voice carries urgency, maybe even a bit of exaggeration. That's common. People often amplify details when they're emotional. Officers arrive. 2 units, sometimes 1. They separate the parties. Standard procedure. Now here's the part most people don't understand. The officer isn't there to validate the caller. The officer is there to assess facts, behavior, and potential violations of the law. And officers are trained to observe things that most civilians completely overlook. Tone of voice, inconsistencies, body language, timing of statements, even the order in which someone tells their story. Karen starts explaining, quickly, maybe too quickly. "She came out of nowhere. I had to slam on my brakes. She was driving crazy. I thought she was going to hit me." The officer listens, nods, asks simple questions. "Where did this start? How fast were you going? Did you change lanes?" Seems harmless, right? But every answer is being evaluated, not just for content, but for credibility. Now the other driver speaks, maybe calmer, maybe less detailed, maybe just says, "She cut me off first, then started yelling." And here's where things begin to shift. Because officers aren't just comparing stories, they're looking for what aligns with physical evidence and behavior. Skid marks, vehicle positioning, damage, dash cams, nearby witnesses, even the emotional state of each person. And sometimes, the person who called the police starts to look less like a victim and more like a contributor to the problem. This is where people get blindsided. They assume calling the police gives them some kind of advantage. It doesn't. In fact, it often puts them under more scrutiny. Let's bring this back to a traffic stop setting, because the same principles apply. You get pulled over. You're already nervous. The officer walks up. "Do you know why I stopped you?" That question alone trips people up more than anything else. Some people immediately admit everything. "Yeah, I was probably speeding." Others deny everything. "No idea, officer." Both responses can have consequences. What the officer is really doing is measuring your awareness and honesty. They're watching how quickly you respond, how confident you sound, whether your answer matches what they observed. Now imagine you just had a conflict with another driver and you called the police. When the officer finally talks to you, your adrenaline is still high. You're talking fast. You're trying to justify your actions, and without realizing it, you start revealing things. I only sped up because they were tailgating me. That one sentence just admitted to speeding. I had to swerve into the other lane to avoid them. Now you've admitted to an unsafe lane change. You're trying to explain your side, but legally, you're building a case against yourself. This is where people get into serious trouble. Not because they intended to, but because they don't understand how officers process information. Let's slow this down for a second. Officers are trained to control the pace of the interaction. If you talk too much, they let you. If you contradict yourself, they remember. If you escalate emotionally, they stay calm, and that contrast matters. Because when it comes time to write a report or testify later, the officer's calm, structured account will carry far more weight than a frantic, inconsistent narrative. And that's exactly how someone who called the police ends up being the one detained, or even arrested. Now let's talk about something most drivers never think about: timing. The moment you're stopped, everything is being timed. How long it takes you to pull over, how you position your vehicle, whether you reach for things before the officer approaches, whether your hands are visible. Even small movements matter. You might think you're just grabbing your registration early to be helpful. The officer might see unexpected movement and interpret it as a potential threat. That changes their tone immediately. Keep your hands where I can see them. Now the interaction is tense, and you haven't even spoken yet. Let's go deeper into the psychology here, because this is where most people make subtle but serious mistakes. When people feel wronged, they want to be heard. That's natural. But during a police interaction, especially one you initiated, talking more doesn't mean helping yourself more. In fact, it often does the opposite. Officers don't need long explanations. They need clear, consistent facts. And when you start adding extra details, especially emotional ones, you increase the chances of saying something that can be used against you. There's also a common myth that being assertive or standing your ground will make officers take you more seriously. In reality, tone matters more than content. You can say the exact same sentence two different ways and get two completely different reactions. "Why am I being questioned like this?" can sound like confusion or confrontation, depending on how you say it, and officers respond accordingly. Now let's bring passengers into the picture, because this is another area where situations spiral quickly. You're driving. Someone else is in the car. Maybe they start talking when the officer approaches. "That wasn't even our fault." Seems harmless, right? But now you've introduced a second voice, potentially contradicting your version of events. Officers will pick up on that immediately. "Sir, I'm speaking with the driver." But the damage may already be done. Now there's inconsistency. Now there's confusion. And confusion often leads to deeper questioning. Sometimes officers will even separate driver and passenger and ask similar questions to both. Not because they expect criminal behavior, but because they're testing consistency. And when answers don't match, suspicion increases. Now let's go back to the scenario where someone calls the police. Karen is explaining her side. The officer asks a simple question again, maybe phrased slightly differently. "So you said you changed lanes to avoid them. Did you signal?" There's a pause. That pause matters, because hesitation tells the officer something. It suggests uncertainty, maybe even realization. And if the answer is no, now there's a clear traffic violation. One small admission can shift the entire direction of the encounter. Now imagine this continues. The officer asks for license and registration, runs the information, maybe comes back with more questions. "Have you had anything to drink tonight?" Even if the situation had nothing to do with alcohol initially, officers are trained to check for impairment whenever there's erratic driving involved. Karen, already stressed, might respond defensively. "Of course not." Tone matters again. Defensiveness can raise suspicion even if the answer is truthful. And now the officer might look closer, smell for alcohol, observe eye movement, listen to speech patterns. Everything becomes part of the assessment. And here's something most people don't realize. Once an officer develops reasonable suspicion of something else, like impairment, the entire scope of the stop can expand. What started as a complaint call or minor traffic issue can turn into a DUI investigation. Now we're in a completely different situation. Let's talk about another common turning point, being asked to step out of the vehicle. This moment makes a lot of people uneasy. Can you step out of the car for me? Legally, in most traffic stop situations in the US, officers can ask drivers to step out of the vehicle for safety reasons. But the way people react to that request often determines what happens next. Some comply calmly, others hesitate. Why do I need to get out? That question, again, isn't necessarily wrong, but tone and timing matter. If it sounds like resistance, the officer may become more direct. Step out of the vehicle. Now it's no longer a request, it's an order, and hesitation at that point can escalate things quickly. Back to our scenario. Karen steps out. The officer notices something, maybe agitation, maybe inconsistency, maybe signs of another violation. And then comes the moment no one expects when they dialed 911. Turn around for me. That's when reality hits. The person who thought they were calling to help is now being detained. Sometimes it's for something minor, reckless driving, filing a false report, disorderly conduct. Other times it escalates further, depending on what the officer uncovered during the interaction. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of these outcomes aren't caused by one big mistake. They're caused by a series of small ones. Talking too much, answering without thinking, letting emotions control tone, interrupting, contradicting, making assumptions about how the officer will interpret things. Each one seems minor in the moment. Together, they can completely change the outcome. Now let me tell you something that might challenge what you've heard before. People often say, just stay silent and you'll be fine. That's not entirely accurate either. Silence is a right, but it's also a behavior that officers interpret. If you go completely silent in a situation where basic communication is expected, it can raise suspicion, depending on context. The key isn't absolute silence, it's controlled, intentional communication. Answer what's required, provide documents, avoid volunteering extra information. There's a balance there, and most people miss it. And yes, later on I'll break down one of the biggest misunderstandings about this that gets drivers into trouble without them realizing it. Now let's talk about document handling, because this is another subtle but important part of traffic stops. You hand over your license and registration. The officer takes them back to their vehicle. Time passes. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe more. People start getting anxious. Why are they taking so long? That anxiety sometimes turns into action. People step out of the car. They walk toward the patrol vehicle. They try to speed things up. That is one of the fastest ways to escalate a situation. From the officer's perspective, that's an unexpected approach, potentially dangerous. Commands come quickly. Get back in your vehicle. Now tension rises again. Everything is about perception and control. The officer controls the scene. When drivers try to change that, even unintentionally, it creates friction, and friction leads to escalation. Let's circle back to the bigger picture. Why does someone who calls the police sometimes end up being the one arrested? Because the moment law enforcement gets involved, the situation becomes an investigation, not a customer service interaction. It's not about who feels right. It's about what can be established, observed, and legally supported. And emotions, while completely human, often interfere with that. People want validation. Officers want clarity. Those are two very different goals. If you remember anything from this, remember this. Every word you say during a traffic stop has potential weight. Not just legally, but behaviorally. Officers are constantly assessing. Are you cooperative? Are you consistent? Are you escalating or de-escalating? Are you aware of what you did? Are you trying to control the situation? Even your posture matters, your eye contact, the speed of your responses. It all feeds into the officer's perception, and perception often drives decisions. So the next time you see those blue lights in your mirror, or find yourself reaching for your phone to call the police on someone else, pause for just a second. Ask yourself what you actually want from that interaction. Because once it starts, it rarely goes the way people imagine. And sometimes, the person who thinks they're reporting a problem ends up becoming part of it in a way they never saw coming.